Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Today with me is Daniel McAdams. And Daniel, good to see you.
Good to see you again, Dr. Paul.
Well, good. We're going to talk a little bit today about the millennials. We've done that in the past, and there's a lot of emphasis on, generations. What generation do you belong to? I think yours is a different generation than the generation I belong to, but it goes on. And of course, I think we both have some reservation of neatly compacting generations, and everybody belongs there, believes such and such. So I think there's a risk there. But everybody knows what they think about when you talk about millennials. And Zero Hedge was carrying an article written by John Malden, a friend of ours, that was talking about millennials. And the title was catchy because it was Millennials Face an Existential Crisis. Of course, we talk about crisis. We talk about the crisis coming from our ridiculous foreign policy, and I talk a lot about the economic crisis and the dollar crisis and all this. So this is interesting and fits in to some of the things that we have talked about. But they also talk about something else that, matter of fact, John goes into reference of a book by called The Fourth Turning. Yeah. This again probably does a lot of positioning people and try to put them in categories in neat little 20-year periods. And I think you have a little bit of knowledge about this in this book that was written on this whole subject.
Yeah, and a lot of people do talk about it. It was written by Neil Howe and William Strauss, published in 1997. And this is a slightly esoteric topic for us, but it is interesting. And as you point out, things don't fit into these neat sort of era kinds of specific categories. But what they wrote about is that there are 4 generational archetypes: the heroes, the artists, the prophets, and the nomad. And they turn with each generation, the next one takes over. As one generation enters their 60, they sort of fade into the twilight, and the new generation comes up. And so the fourth turning refers to the fact that the millennials, which are, according to these archetypes, the hero generation, they are rising to the forefront. These are the ones born between 1982 and 2004. And so this fourth turning, the turning into the fourth archetype, is characterized by crisis, essentially. And how he references the archetype of the hero, how they do, is they come of age at a time of crisis, come of age. They resolve that crisis and become powerful in midlife and have a spiritual awakening later. The premise of this whole idea is that as children, as very young people, you have imprinted upon you ideas and attitudes that you carry with you for the rest of your lives. So this generation largely was imprinted in the 90s with the values that they had. And so it's an interesting setup, but it also relates to a lot of what you've talked about.
Yeah, and it sort of blends in. I might not have come to this the same conclusion or similar conclusions, but in a different manner, because I see something significant happen. And I mention it very often that it's an end of an era for economic problems, and I believe that the announcement of that new era was at the turn of the century with the stock market collapse, the breaking of the NASDAQ bubble, and that there's nothing but stagnation ever since. So there is something significant going on and sort of blends in with this. But these crises that generations after generation face are generally about 4. We have economic crisis, which I think is significant to us now, but military crises. The world's been filled with militarism for a long time, and even in my lifetime, I remember World War II and the subsequent war since, and I remember the tail end of the Depression. And then there's cultural crises. We certainly are seeing that right now, probably much worse in Europe than in this country, but we still have it, and I think that has a lot to do with what's going on in the presidential race. And then there's also religious ramifications. I think that's more true, say, in the Middle East. Europe is sort of that way, sometimes the absence of religion and other religions that fill voids. And I don't see that as much in this country, even in our history or potentially. I see it as a contributing factor because certain religious factors and even some Christian factions actually gave strong endorsement to the war effort of George Bush, and support, which introduced the notion of religion. But I think right now what I see coming, and that we're in the middle of, not so much coming, is the economic problems, which involves a dollar crisis, inflation, paying off debt. And this generation is inheriting this, and there will be a crisis. The crisis is already on our doorstep, but I think we should expect it's going to get much worse.
It's very interesting if you look at the premise of being imprinted early in childhood. This generation will have started being imprinted or influenced, or whatever the word is, in the early 90s. And if you think about what happened then, it was the immediate post-Cold War era. And looking back on it, I'm sure you remember it too. We sort of became a nation adrift. What do we do now? And it wasn't very long before the neocons and others came in to fill the void, and we started the phony war against Iraq in '91. But that phony war became a permanent war, the war on terror. And I think that war on terror, this permanent war, sort of morphed now. What we're seeing is a total militarization of society. Completely.
Yeah, and prior to that, or at least prior to the Korean War, wars were fought with more determination, that there was a declaration of war. We knew either Germany was the enemy or Japan was the enemy, and then they would fight and there was an end to it. Now, since the 1990s, they're sort of perpetual, and they go on. Even Korea and Vietnam eventually ended, but right now we've been fighting wars in the Middle East, and we're always looking for a new fight. Yeah. And this leads to a great deal of frustration, but also contributes to the economic turmoil we have, because none of these wars are fought cheaply. It's very expensive, and emotionally and psychologically, and you see the ramifications, you see the medical ramifications. And although most people have put the wars aside right now because not a lot of Americans are getting shot and killed in the Middle East, the ramifications are mass immigration problems and caring for our veterans, and this is all a cost. Who's it going to fall on? Who's going to pay for the cost of caring for all these people and dealing with the psychiatric problems and the epidemic of suicides? And it's going to be the millennials that'll have to pay for it. What about paying it back to economics? Who's going to pay for the cost of the retirement of the baby boomers? Yeah. The numbers aren't there, and the wealth is not there. We're not producing wealth like we used to, so we're not able to do this. So it looks like we're limping along, and we get a free ride because we get to issue the gold, which is the dollar at the moment, and we get to spend it. So we continue to live way beyond our means. But a system like this, I believe, is working its way to a climactic end. The Soviet system Mises knew before it even started it would end, because socialism can't work. And that ended in a climactic end. You already mentioned in the 90s a significant change. And and right now we've just witnessed recently, they're in the midst of a crisis in Venezuela. The end of socialism, which people loved when they had free gasoline and free food and everything didn't cost very much. Socialism is a pretty good idea, but until it ends, until they no longer can finance it. But I think that's what we're working for right now, working toward that. We're going to wake up someday and recognize that this country is really bankrupt. And I think the earliest announcement of the bankruptcy was when people say, well, we never defaulted. I've heard this said in this presidential. We have never defaulted. We're never going to default. But we defaulted with the American people in the 1930s. We refused to, give them their gold that they were promised. The paper was redeemable in gold. And what about in 1971? We refused to pay foreigners in gold that we had promised to do. And we got away with it. So, but then we've introduced this notion that all we have to do is print money. They'll take money and then loan it back to us and then blame them for the problems. This is the story about China. We print money, we still get stuff from them, and they take our paper and then they finance our debt. And people say, well, they've caused all our problems, But my point is, it's going to come to an end. And it will come to an end climatically. It's going to be sudden and it's going to be very severe. The millennials will suffer probably the most, but everybody will suffer.
I think of the sort of imprinting episodes of supposedly my generation, Generation X, and I think back, and you've talked about this so many times, the ending of even the pseudo-gold standard and the complete unleashing of the paper dollar onto society and the implications of that for my generation. And then the malaise, I guess you'd call it, of the 90s, where the Bill Clinton era, where we were looking for monsters to destroy because the big monster, the USSR, was gone. And so we were fiddling about in Kosovo. We were dabbling in regime change in Eastern Europe. We were thinking about expanding NATO. And this is something we talked about before the show. One thing indicative of this is really the rise not to the forefront of the military-industrial complex as a real factor beyond any even reasonable threat to us.
It seems like one crisis and problem leads to another if you don't solve it and you paper it over. Because in many ways, the Depression ushered in the age of inflation, wholesale inflation, in the entitlement system. They didn't recognize what really caused the Depression, so they said, well, it must have been the gold standard. It must have been too much capitalism, so therefore we need more government regulation. So they ushered in the age of Social Security and auto entitlements, which blossomed and grew. And it was really benefiting the middle class and many wealthy people than the poor. The poor got poorer, and there was a healthier middle class. But that, from the Depression time and the wars that occurred, led to the 1971 crisis, which you picked up there and showed how this has distorted things. So to me, it's always the acceptance of bad ideas. Yes, there's generational things, but it's the ideas of war. Why do they fight war? And is it a consequence of unwise intervention? Do we spend too much money because we think that welfareism, entitlements, and this kind of transfer payments will solve the problems? Seems to, for a while, until it ends. And people say, well, you're blowing it way out of proportion. We'll never go through what Venezuela's going through. And let's hope not. Let's hope we get smart enough. But the policies we have, both economic and military, can lead to those sort of circumstances where it just doesn't work. So the Soviet system didn't work because their economic system was deeply flawed. But it also, they overextended themselves, militarily, which is something most empires do. And we're sort of vulnerable. Now, in the 1960s, which I remember very well because the economics wasn't the major factor, because LBJ said we can have guns and butter, and as long as that was happening, the economy, moved along okay. But it also led to a lot of problems down the road. But what finally, when the war got unpopular, after thousands, probably up to close to 60,000 Americans were lost. Think how tolerant. We have problems today, but tolerating 60,000 Americans being killed, and the numbers didn't matter anymore. 1 or 2, 10 people got killed over the weekend with some nut. That's big news. Well, thank goodness it's big news compared to 10,000 on a weekend. Nobody cares. Yeah. So that went on, and the people finally rose up and said, this war is stupid. And they said, well, we can't, the whole thing was, LBJ says, I don't want to be the first president to lose a war. No, he waited and gave it to Nixon, and Nixon expanded the war, and he goes on. But they never stop and think about the fundamentals about what a proper foreign policy would be like in a true republic, one that is designed to protect liberty. They don't get to that point. And we have a depression, and then we have inflation, and we have excessive debt, and productivity crashing, and millennials and others that are graduating from college now can't even get jobs, and they have debt of $100,000 and $200,000, and they never ask the question, what is wrong? And we don't even hear the questions being asked in the campaign, is what's frustrating and aggravating. They just march on. Yes, we need a stronger military, and we need more entitlements, and we need more migration, because people people have been lost their homes and all. And I'm certainly not opposed to, a much more open society, but I'm close to the idea of a policy that produces these problems, excessive militarism and an economic policy that is deeply flawed.
Yeah, and I do think that the young generation, that millennials, are questioning this. And I think it's indicated in a few things. First of all, the huge support that your two campaigns had in 08 and 12 with young people. It was phenomenal. It hadn't been seen. Even the mainstream, which did its best to ignore you, had to comment on it. And unfortunately, ideologically, they've also been attracted to Sanders and Trump. I think for similar reasons, because they sense something is wrong, and they are looking to candidates who are outside the mainstream. They didn't glom on to Jeb Bush or Hillary Clinton. They're looking for someone who understands that something is wrong. Now, the solutions offered, as you would say, are not too great between these two, but the sense is there.
I frequently make the point that prevailing attitudes are very important. If the prevailing attitude of people is that, we have to go to war in the Middle East because there are a lot of bad people over there, and that's their idea, and that we're going, like the propaganda of going into Iraq because Saddam Hussein was a great danger to it. That was a prevailing attitude, and people went along with it. The prevailing attitude, or the attitude of we don't care in the 60s, allowed us to get into Vietnam in a stupid war. But the prevailing attitude finally came about that the people were sick and tired of the war. And, of course, the culture was changing. The whole 60s was a really difficult decade. So I think those ideas are very important. In spite of the mess that this country is in spite of what this younger generation is facing, because they are inheriting all these bad policy and a lot of debt, that nobody should become despondent of this, because there's an answer to it. And it's not found in bullies and socialism and all these things. It's found in correct ideas. And they say, well, they criticize me for being determined about ideas, but everything is driven by ideas. Even complacency is an idea. And everybody wants interventionism and utilitarianism because it doesn't sound like far left or far right, too much freedom, not enough freedom, this sort of thing. But that is an ideological function, and we've had a lot of that, the utilitarianism and military interventionism, to do good for the world. But you mentioned the young people, and that, of course, is where I've been excited and very interested. And we should emphasize ideas, and we should emphasize leadership. Prevailing attitudes don't pop up. They do when there's a lot of frustration, but there's usually some leadership, intellectual leadership, to say that there is an alternative. And this is why I'm so interested in Austrian economics. I mean, if you want to do good for the world, you should study Austrian economics and promote it. And you want to study non-interventionist foreign policy, and then you will do some good. But if it's just tinkering around the edges and not challenge the basic function, you have to challenge the ideas. And you don't need a large number of people. And I've frequently mentioned in the campaign, you only need about 7 or 8% of the population who are in leadership positions to say these are the answers. But this, as bad as this is, as far as I'm concerned, this is a real opportunity for us and young people to look at the ideas that will make a difference. So that's where the investment has to be. And it has to be a recognition that we have delivered to the younger generation and the current generation that's trying to get a job, a system that is deeply flawed. And the ideology is what really counts, and you don't have to sit around and how am I going to convert 51%. Well, the 51% get converted when the leadership is correct and on target and moving it and having an impact, and there's a need. And right now there certainly is a need for the answers that we desperately need in this country today, whether it's economic or on foreign policy. And if that were the case, I would like to smooth these generational things out and say that it's a smooth growth toward more economic freedom, more domestic liberty, and more peace in the world. And we won't have to think so much about what generation did you belong to, what kind of things did you suffer in the 30s, and what kind of did you suffer in the 60s. I'd like to see a steady evolutionary growth with an understanding of the ideas of liberty, which will produce the prosperity and peace that we all desire. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.